The year is 1623, and inside the suffocating velvet silence of the Topkapi Palace, a 15-year-old girl is not preparing for a wedding but for an execution of her soul. The heavy silk brocade of her gown feels less like a celebration and more like a shroud, weighing down her slender frame as she is escorted not toward a festive hall, but into a locked, windowless chamber deep within the imperial residence. The heavy oak doors groan shut behind her, sealing with a finality that suggests they are not there to ensure privacy, but to enforce absolute control. The women standing in the shadows of the room are not smiling aunts or joyous guests. They are stone-faced attendants, hardened instructors, and silent witnesses who have seen this ritual destroy young spirits before. A court physician, an old man with eyes that have learned to see nothing, stands silently in the corner, holding a parchment and quill, waiting to clinically record the dismantling of a princess. You were told this was a sacred tradition, a rite of passage for the chosen, but what no one whispered to you in the corridors was that every single twitch of your finger, every intake of breath, and every flicker of fear in your eyes would be judged, documented, and used against you. Suddenly, the months of enforced silence you endured make a terrifying kind of sense. You remember your mother's face from that morning, the way her trembling hands lingered too long while she pinned the jewels into your hair, and the way she steadfastly refused to meet your gaze, not because she didn't care, but because looking into your eyes would have shattered her own fragile composure. She knew what you are only just realizing, that this ceremony is not about love, affection, or union. It is about total, crushing obedience. This is not a dark fairy tale spun for shock value. For more than 600 years, the Ottoman Empire, a superpower that dictated the rhythm of the world, maintained a domestic system so carefully constructed and so psychologically brutal that even the enemies who feared their cannons would not have wished it upon their own daughters. It was a mechanism of control spoken of only in terrified whispers during its existence, and later scrubbed from the history books to protect the legacy of the dynasty. The year was 1623, and a brilliant 15-year-old princess was moments away from discovering that an imperial marriage possessed two distinct faces. There was the public face, the one the world saw, dazzling with celebrations, thundering music, religious blessings, and rivers of gold. And then there was the private face, a ritual performed behind sealed doors, documented in stifling silence, and remembered only by the women it broke. What transpired on that night was not merely a private tragedy for one girl. It was the hidden tax of absolute power, a price that every daughter of a sultan was expected to pay with her sanity. When this story reaches the moment that unsettles your spirit the most, I want you to pause and tell me where you are watching from, because this is a darkness that no one should have to witness alone. Now, let us drift back through the currents of time to the empire itself. For over 6 centuries, spanning from 1299 until the final collapse in 1922, the Ottoman Empire stretched like a shoreless, devouring ocean across 3 continents, swallowing nations and histories whole. Its vast armies thundered across the globe, their boots marching from the stone walls of Vienna in the west to the scorching deserts of Yemen in the east. After the cataclysmic fall of Constantinople in 1453, the city was reborn as Istanbul, the beating, golden heart of imperial power, and atop its highest hill, the Topkapi Palace rose as its most dazzling, impenetrable symbol. Within those gilded walls, under domes painted with the blue of the heavens, the fate of nations was decided by the stroke of a pen. But deep in the shadows, hidden away from the sun, the fate of human souls was sealed in silence. Behind the intricate lattice windows that turned the world into a fractured puzzle and down the endless, winding corridors, the imperial harem formed a parallel world, a sealed universe where more than 800 women lived and died at the height of the empire's splendor. In this claustrophobic city within a city, every breath was observed by a rival, every gesture was measured for weakness, and the distance between advancement and total destruction was often just a single misstep. By the year 1530, when the unprecedented title of Haseki Sultan was bestowed upon the legendary the harem had mutated into something far more dangerous than a domestic space. It became a silent battlefield of shifting alliances, lethal ambition, and wars waged without swords but with poison and whispers. The concubines who filled its halls, most of them Christian captives stolen from the villages of Europe or purchased in the slave markets of North Africa, entered the palace stripped of their names and their pasts, clinging to nothing but the fragile hope of survival. Their days were consumed with the arts of pleasure, music, poetry, embroidery, and the rigorous practice of ritual obedience, all in service of a single desperate possibility, catching the Sultan's eye. Ironically, history reveals that many of these enslaved women possessed more pathways to influence and even freedom than the daughters born at the very summit of power, because royal blood came with its own unique, unbreakable prison. During the era historians now refer to as the Sultanate of Women, formidable figures like Kozum Sultan and Turhan Hadisi Sultan exercised astonishing influence, guiding imperial councils, steering the direction of wars, and effectively ruling the empire from behind veils of strict protocol. Their authority was so vast it reshaped the very foundations of the state. But while these matriarchs wielded power, the princesses born into the dynasty lived under a different, darker star. They were not rulers, they were guarantees. They were human clauses written into diplomatic agreements, living seals stamped onto political alliances. They were highborn pawns placed on the board to secure loyalty, suppress potential rebellions, or reward the obedience of powerful men the Sultan needed to control. And it was into this unforgiving system that Princess Fatma Sultan was born in the year 1606. She was the daughter of Sultan Ahmed I and Kozum, a woman capable of ruling an empire from the shadows but unable to save her daughter from the machinery of the state. Fatma grew up in the gilded cage of the palace, surrounded by lush gardens, learned scholars, and stacks of manuscripts written in Arabic and Persian. The court chroniclers of the time praised her sharp intelligence, and her tutors marveled at a discipline rare for a child of her age. She immersed herself in the study of astronomy, calligraphy, history, and religious law. By all accounts, she was exceptional, a prodigy who spoke 4 languages fluently and could debate learned men with a confidence that belied her years. She was known to gaze at the night sky with a burning curiosity that actually terrified her tutors, because they knew that for a princess, curiosity was a dangerous thing. And in the end, none of her brilliance mattered, because from the very moment she drew her first breath, her life was never her own. Her destiny had already been scripted by the needs of the throne. She would be given in marriage, not for love, not for choice, not for personal happiness, but as a cold mechanism of power. From the moment of her birth, Fatma Sultan's future had been written on invisible parchments that dictated she would be married not when she was physically or emotionally ready, nor if she wished it, but solely when the empire required it to happen. Her body was a tool of diplomacy, her obedience was the wax that would seal alliances. And so, the decision was made by the powers above her. The man chosen to be her husband was Kara Mustafa Pasha, a hardened military commander shaped by years of brutal warfare against Persia, a man nearly 20 years her senior. The union was not born of affection, romance, or even familiarity, it was forged entirely through cold calculation. For him, the marriage meant social advancement, protection from his enemies, and dangerous proximity to the throne. For her, still a teenager, it meant becoming a living instrument of state policy, a piece placed on the imperial chessboard to check a rival, and 3 months before the wedding was to take place, the true ordeal began. The process was called Turvil and Mubarak, the so-called sacred education reserved exclusively for Ottoman princesses. It had no equivalent anywhere else in the known world. This was not instruction in the traditional sense. It was psychological conditioning, a system refined over centuries to strip royal daughters of their pride and replace it with unquestioning robotic obedience. The woman assigned to oversee this brutal transformation was Gulnur Hatun, a woman of 60 winters, the head of the harem, and a veteran of more than a dozen such preparations. She had seen princesses break under the pressure before, and she knew exactly how long it took to dismantle a human will. Under her unyielding supervision, Fatma was led into the dais, the bride's chamber, a suffocating room lined with heavy Persian carpets and dark ebony panels that seemed to absorb the light. Nothing inside this room was decorative. Every object carried a specific weight of meaning, and every angle served to remind the girl of her singular purpose. From the first light of dawn until high noon, day after punishing day, Fatma was forced to rehearse rituals of reverence until her body screamed in protest. She learned 18 distinct forms of bowing. Each posture served a specific function: how to greet, how to serve, how to kneel, how to lie down, and how to wait in absolute silence for her husband's arrival. Even the simple act of walking was no longer instinctive. She was drilled in the urish and the seat, steps measured to the width of a finger, her head lowered at precisely 30 degrees, her hands never rising above the level of her heart. Every movement was designed to erase the memory of the girl she had been, and every correction pushed her closer to the hollow figure she was expected to become, but the control of her movement was only the beginning. Speech became the most merciless discipline of all. Fatma's vocabulary was slashed and reduced to just 43 approved words. These were expressions of gratitude, apology, submission, and acceptance. Nothing else was permitted. Any attempt to speak freely, any deviation in tone, or any question asked out of turn was punished with severity: fasting, isolation in damp rooms of reflection, or public humiliation before the sneering court. Her obedience was not merely assumed, it was rigorously tested. At regular intervals, Fatma was brought before a tribunal of women and eunuchs, presided over by her own mother, Kozum. There, her compliance was evaluated as if it were currency, measured, weighed, and judged for value. And still, this was not the worst part of her torment. Hidden beneath the palace, in underground chambers that few ever entered, preparations for the first night began in earnest. They were called Talim and Gurk. Exact replicas of bridal chambers had been constructed below ground, away from the prying eyes of the sun. Inside them stood wax mannequins, anatomical figures commissioned from Venetian artisans and crafted with an unsettling, corpse-like precision. Before stern instructors, Fatma was forced to rehearse gestures and acts that no girl her age should have been made to understand. Every reaction she had was recorded in coded logs. Fear, tears, resistance. Each sign of distress condemned her to more sessions, more repetition, and more psychological conditioning. Slowly, methodically, the girl who once gazed at the stars with wonder was reduced to a compliant body. Her curiosity was dismantled, and her spirit was disciplined into a heavy silence. She was no longer a daughter of emperors, she was an apprentice to her own tragic fate, and the training did not stop there. Beyond posture, movement, and silence came the lesson of endurance. Any sign of resistance, a lifted chin, a misplaced sigh, a defiant glance, brought immediate punishment. She endured prolonged fasting until weakness set in, repetitive physical exercises designed to exhaust the body, and confinement in cold, airless cells. Often, these humiliations were carried out in front of the entire female court, not in private, not discreetly, but publicly, as if she were a disobedient servant rather than a princess of the highest royal blood. Alongside this physical control came a process of mental purification. Fatma was forced to memorize verses drawn from Ottoman and Persian treatises on marital obedience. Passages from the Nazihat al-Muluk and Akhlaqasini filled her days, texts that praised submission, sacrifice, and the erasure of the self as sacred virtues. She recited them aloud before an audience of concubines and eunuchs who acted as her judges. The girl who once spoke of astronomy and poetry now repeated words designed to extinguish her will. Prayer, too, became a weapon in this arsenal. 5 times a day, at exact hours, Fatma was required to perform specially composed prayers written by the empire's ulama. These were not acts of personal faith or connection to the divine. They were instruments of control, prayers meant to dissolve her individuality and redirect her devotion entirely toward her future husband. Even her body learned submission through the act of worship. And still the humiliations continued. Twice each week, before the entire female court, Fatma was required to serve her own father's favored concubines. She washed them, combed their hair, fed them by hand, and dressed them for their nights with the sultan. This ritual was deliberate and cruel. It was meant to crush the final remnants of her pride, to teach the princess that even those who merely shared her father's bed stood above her in the hierarchy of power. Witnesses later noted that Fatma often broke down in sobs while fastening the garments on these women, her hands shaking uncontrollably as the court looked on in stony silence. 1 week before the wedding, the regimen intensified to its peak. Fatma was moved to the Jelan Koru, the bride's pavilion, an isolated structure sealed from outside sound. There, every detail of her existence was strictly controlled. Her meals were regulated to the ounce: pomegranates, honey, almonds, goat's milk, and Yemeni spices. Her baths were supervised daily, using perfumed oils infused with valerian, poppy, and orange blossom. These elixirs were prepared by alchemists trained in Cordoba and Samarkand, designed to calm the nerves, soften the will, and induce a state of surrender. The walls of the pavilion were draped with tapestries depicting ideal wives. Obedient, fertile, silent women promised heavenly rewards for their earthly submission. Venetian mirrors were placed strategically throughout the rooms, forcing Fatma to observe herself constantly, as if her own gaze had become another form of surveillance. By then she understood the terrible truth: her body no longer belonged to her. Her voice had been reduced to fragments. Even her thoughts were no longer safe, and the empire was not finished with her yet, because the day of the wedding was approaching, and what awaited her then would complete what this preparation had begun. This practice was known as muraqabah. In its original form, it was a Sufi mystical exercise, a method of inward reflection meant to discipline the mind. Inside the palace, however, it was transformed into something else entirely: a psychological weapon, a system designed to force the princess to surveil herself. Not only were her actions monitored, but she was taught to police her own thoughts. Even her inner world was no longer a sanctuary. In that isolation, Fatma began to understand the full extent of what had been done to her. She was no longer the mistress of her own life. Her body had been trained into obedience, her voice reduced to fragments, and her thoughts reshaped into reflexes of submission. The preparation had achieved its dark purpose. The curious, intelligent young girl who once dreamed of the heavens had been methodically erased. And then the day finally arrived. March 15, 1623. From the first light of dawn, Istanbul pulsed like an overflowing heart. The streets filled with the smoke of incense and the sound of music. Processions wound through the city streets. In Topkapi Palace, banquets were laid on gold tableware and guests moved through halls alive with celebration. There were dances from Persia and Andalusia, and songs performed by the empire's finest musicians. Janissaries competed before the Sultan, displaying strength and discipline. To the people outside it looked like a festival worthy of heaven itself. But for Fatma, it was a sentence being carried out. Chroniclers noted that while guests laughed and drank wine, the princess remained utterly silent. Her lips were dry, her gaze unfocused. Palace physicians watched her closely, recording tremors, cold sweats despite the cool March air, an absence of appetite, and sudden episodes of breathlessness, signs we would now recognize as severe, crippling anxiety. Public splendor masked private terror. And when the final toast was raised and the civilian guests withdrew, the most dreaded moment began. Fatma was escorted from the palace halls toward the nuptial pavilion built deep within the private gardens according to ancestral plans dating back to the time of Mem II. The structure was octagonal, divided into 3 ascending levels. Each level served a ritual purpose: purification, presentation, consummation. Nothing about this architecture was accidental. Every corridor and every threshold had been designed to strip the princess of agency and transform the ceremony into an act of total submission. The first level was known as Taja K2, the Chamber of Purification. There, Fatma was subjected to ritual baths that lasted for hours. Carrara marble reflected the torchlight across the water. Essences of Damascus rose, Shiraz oil, sandalwood, and Somali ambergris clung to her skin. Alchemists applied ointments infused with diluted opium, mandrake, and other substances meant to calm the body and dull resistance. Court doctors described the resulting state as an ecstasy of submission. The second level was Teslim K2, the floor of surrender. Here, Fatma was dressed in her nuptial gown, white silk woven with gold thread and adorned with pearls from the Persian Gulf. To an outsider, it appeared regal. In truth, it was engineered for control. Hidden cords and internal fastenings restricted her movement. The crown's weight limited her posture. Anklets and bracelets subtly constrained her steps. Thick-soled shoes made escape impossible. The garment was a prison disguised as splendor. While Fatma was being transformed into a symbol, her future husband underwent very different preparations. Surrounded by advisors and seasoned war veterans, Kara Mustafa Pasha received instruction not on marriage but on domination. He was taught methods of intimidation, calculated phrases meant to humiliate, and techniques to impose authority over an imperial princess. There would be no uncertainty in this union, no resistance allowed. Then came the ascent to the third level, Sif K2, the Chamber of Consummation. Its walls were covered with tapestries depicting conquered cities, defeated armies, and captive princesses. The imagery was deliberate. It drew a clear parallel between victory in war and victory in the marriage bed. The furniture itself had been crafted for control: beds with concealed cord systems, cushions soaked in soothing oils, and low light designed to disorient and weaken resolve. It was there, surrounded by symbols of conquest, that Fatma faced her most feared night. Barely supported by her own breath, she became the living seal of a political pact. Official chronicles would later describe the wedding as a triumph, but inside that room, a different reality was unfolding. When the doors of the Sif K2 closed behind the procession, Fatma was left alone with her husband. Medical records from the time describe what followed as a complete collapse of the spirit. Months of discipline and humiliation had exhausted her capacity to respond. Her body trembled uncontrollably. Her voice fell to a whisper. Her eyes drifted as if fixed on something no one else could see. Imperial doctors later named the condition Sima and Tam, total shock. Kara Mustafa Pasha, trained in sieges and battlefields, initially interpreted her state as defiance. He believed it was arrogance that needed to be broken. He applied the methods he had been taught: intimidation, controlled force, and calculated gestures of dominance. But there was no rebellion to overcome, only emptiness. Fatma was no longer present. Her mind had retreated into deep dissociation, abandoning the body as a final means of survival. When the marriage was eventually consummated after hours of failed attempts, hidden observers recorded the event as traumatic for all involved. Documents written in Persian code speak of internal hemorrhages, repeated loss of consciousness, and what physicians called ruh sukmek, the departure of the soul. From that night onward, Fatma Sultan was never the same. In the days that followed, even the strictest instructors in the harem were alarmed. The princess developed selective mutism. She spoke only when directly addressed and then only in whispers. Her appetite vanished entirely, forcing attendants to feed her against her will. The brilliant child who once debated scholars and studied the stars had disappeared. And what came next would ensure she never returned. Episodes of uncontrollable crying began without warning and could last for hours. Worse still, what court chroniclers referred